Maya Thompson had exactly $5 to her name, and she knew it down to the last cent because she had counted it 3 times that evening, hoping somehow the number would change if she looked at it long enough. It never did. $5. That was what stood between her and an empty gas tank, and an empty gas tank meant she might not make it to her shift at the diner the next morning. She sat in her car in the parking lot of a small grocery store, the engine off to save fuel, and stared at the crumpled bill on the passenger seat like it owed her an apology. Outside, the late afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the rooftops of the small Georgia town she had lived in her whole life, painting everything in that soft orange light that made even tired, worn-out places look a little bit beautiful. Maya didn't notice the light. She was too busy doing math in her head, the kind of math that never seemed to add up no matter how many times she tried. Rent was due in 4 days, her phone bill was already a week late, and her mother, who lived 2 towns over, had called that morning sounding more exhausted than usual, the kind of tired that came from chemotherapy and worry rather than from a hard day's work. Maya hadn't told her mother about the $5. She hadn't told her mother about a lot of things lately, because her mother had enough to carry without adding her daughter's bank account to the list. It hadn't always been this way. 2 years earlier, Maya had been a sophomore in a business program at a college a few hours away, the first person in her family to make it past a community college, the pride of her grandmother who used to call her "my little CEO," even though Maya hadn't decided yet what kind of business she wanted to run. She just knew she wanted to run something. She wanted to build something that outlasted her, something her family could point to and say, "She did that. She made that happen." College had not been easy to get to in the first place. Maya had worked through most of high school stocking shelves at a hardware store, saving whatever she could while keeping her grades high enough to qualify for a partial scholarship. She remembered the day the acceptance letter arrived, how she had run down the street to her grandmother's porch instead of waiting for her to come over, how Odessa had read the letter twice out loud, slowly, like she wanted to make sure every word was real before she let herself cry. Those 2 years at school had felt like the first real proof that the life she imagined for herself was something more than a daydream. She studied late into the night in the library, took a part-time job answering phones in the admissions office, and made a small circle of friends who used to joke that Maya was going to be the one who actually used her business degree to change something instead of just hanging it on a wall. Then her mother's diagnosis came, and everything Maya had been building toward got put on a shelf, the way you set something fragile aside when the house catches fire and you have to deal with what's burning first. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of a marketing class, and Maya could still remember the exact words the doctor used when her mother finally repeated them to her over the phone that night. She had sat on the floor of her dorm room for almost an hour afterward, unable to make herself stand up, unable to make herself believe that the woman who had raised her alone since Maya was 7 years old, who had worked double shifts at a laundry service for most of Maya's childhood without ever once complaining about it, was suddenly the one who needed taking care of. She left school within the month. She moved back home into the small house she had grown up in, took over the bills her mother could no longer manage on her own, and picked up 2 jobs, one at the diner and one cleaning offices on the weekends, because medical bills did not wait for anyone's convenience, and neither did rent. She told herself it was temporary, the way people tell themselves a lot of things to get through the day, but 2 years had a way of stretching out longer than anyone expects when they first use the word temporary. That evening, with $5 on the seat beside her, Maya decided she needed gas more than she needed dinner, so she drove the half-mile to the gas station near the highway exit, the one with the flickering sign that had been missing its O in open for as long as she could remember. She pulled up to the pump, got out, and started feeding the bill into the machine when she noticed the man at the pump next to hers. He looked to be somewhere in his 60s, with gray hair cut close and a face that had clearly seen a lot of sun and a lot of years. He wore a flannel shirt that had gone soft and faded from many washes, the kind of shirt a man wears because he likes it, not because it impresses anyone. His car was an old sedan, dusty along the wheel wells, with a dent in the back bumper that looked like it had a story behind it. He was patting down the pockets of his jeans with growing frustration, checking and rechecking as if his wallet might suddenly appear if he looked hard enough. "You okay?" Maya asked, because that was the kind of question she asked people, even when she had her own troubles weighing on her. The man let out a short, embarrassed laugh and shook his head. "Forgot my wallet. Can you believe that? 62 years old, and I leave the house without my own wallet, like I'm 20 and still learning how to be a grown man." He gestured toward his car, left it sitting right there on the kitchen counter. "I'm not even sure how I made it this far without noticing." "That happens to everybody," Maya said, though she wasn't sure if that was entirely true. It hadn't happened to her in years, mostly because she never let her wallet out of her sight, not because she was careful, but because there usually wasn't much in it worth losing track of. "Well, it's happening to me at the worst possible time," the man said, glancing at the gas gauge through his windshield. "I'm on empty, more or less. I've got maybe enough to roll a few more miles before this thing just stops on me, and I'm not exactly close to home." Maya looked at her own pump, at the $5 she had just finished feeding into it, watching the numbers climb slowly toward a tank that still wouldn't be full, not even close. She thought about her rent, she thought about her phone bill, she thought about her mother, and then, for reasons she couldn't fully explain even to herself later, she thought about her grandmother. Her grandmother, Odessa, had passed away when Maya was 16, but her voice still lived somewhere in the back of Maya's mind, especially in moments like this one. Odessa used to say that kindness wasn't about how much you had to give, it was about whether you were willing to give what you had. She used to say that the Lord didn't measure generosity in dollars, he measured it in willingness. Maya had heard those words so many times growing up that they had become part of her, the way a song you've heard 1,000 times becomes part of the soundtrack of your life, without you even trying to memorize it. "I don't have much," Maya said slowly, reaching into her pocket where she had tucked away a single, slightly crumpled $5 bill, the only money she had left until her paycheck came in 2 days. "But you can have this. It's not much, maybe enough to get you to a station closer to home, but it's something." The man's expression shifted from surprise to something softer, something almost moved. "I can't take that," he said. "That might be all you've got." "It is all I've got," Maya admitted with a small laugh, because there was no point pretending otherwise. "But you need it more right now than I need to know exactly how much is in my pocket. Take it. Pay it forward sometime, if you get the chance." The man studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that made Maya feel like he was trying to memorize her face, or maybe trying to understand something about her that went deeper than a $5 bill. Then he reached out and took the money gently, like it was something fragile. "What's your name?" he asked. "Maya." "Maya," he repeated, like he was testing how it sounded. "Thank you, Maya. I mean that. You don't know what this means." "It's just $5, she said, though something in his voice made her wonder if it really was just that, or if there was more going on than she understood. "Sometimes $5 is more than $5, the man said, almost to himself. Then he tipped his head toward her in a small nod, climbed into his old sedan, and drove off toward the highway, leaving Maya standing there in the fading light, watching his taillights disappear. She didn't think much more about it that night. She went home to the small apartment she shared with her roommate, Denise, a nursing student who worked nights at the hospital and was rarely home at the same hours as Maya. For once, though, Denise was sitting at the kitchen table when Maya walked in, eating cereal out of a mug because all the bowls were dirty, her scrubs still on from an earlier shift. "You look like you've been hit by a truck," Denise said, not unkindly, glancing up from her phone. "Long day," Maya said, dropping her bag by the door and heading to the fridge, which held very little besides a carton of eggs, half a stick of butter, and the rice she'd cooked 2 days earlier. "Gave my last $5 to some old man at the gas station who forgot his wallet." Denise raised an eyebrow. "Your last $5, Maya." "He needed it more than I did in that exact moment," Maya said, scooping rice into a bowl and warming it in the microwave. "I'll figure out the rest. I always do. You always say that, Denise said, though there was no real argument behind it, just the tired affection of two people who had lived together long enough to know each other's patterns. One of these days, you're going to give away your last $5, and there won't be a next paycheck to fix it. Maybe, Maya said, eating standing up at the counter, because she was too tired to sit down properly. But what was I supposed to do? Watch him stand there and not help? My grandmother would come back from the grave just to swat me on the back of the head. Denise laughed at that, the kind of laugh that came easy between old friends, and the conversation drifted toward easier things, a show they'd both been meaning to watch, a co-worker of Denise's who kept showing up late, the noisy upstairs neighbor who never seemed to sleep. By the time Maya climbed into bed, the gas station had already started to fade into the background of her mind, just one more small moment in a day full of small moments. She lay in the dark that night thinking about bills, about her mother's treatment schedule, about whether she'd be able to scrape together enough for rent by Friday. She did not think about the man at the gas station, not really, not beyond a passing thought that she hoped he'd made it home safely. If someone had told her that night that her $5 was about to change the entire direction of her life, she would have laughed, the tired kind of laugh that comes out when something sounds too far-fetched to even consider. The next morning came fast, the way mornings do when you haven't slept enough. Maya pulled on her uniform, a light blue polo shirt with the diner's logo stitched over the heart, and drove to work with the gas gauge still hovering dangerously close to empty, praying it would hold out until payday. The diner, a place called Magnolia Plate, sat just off the main road through town, a squat brick building with red booths inside that had been there since before Maya was born. She had been working there for almost 2 years, long enough to know most of the regulars by name, and long enough to have memorized the slight wobble in table number 6 that nobody had ever bothered to fix. The morning rush came and went the way it usually did. Farmers and truck drivers and a few retired folks who came in every day at the same time for the same coffee and the same conversation about the weather. There was Mr. Calloway, who always ordered the same plate of eggs and grits and complained, gently, that the coffee wasn't as strong as it used to be, though he drank 3 cups of it anyway. There was a young couple who came in every other Tuesday, splitting a single plate of pancakes because that was all they could afford, and Maya always found a way to bring them extra butter and syrup without charging for it, a small kindness Pete pretended not to notice. Maya moved through the rush the way she always did, refilling coffee cups, scribbling orders on her little green pad, smiling even when her feet ached and her mind was somewhere else entirely, doing math about rent and electricity and whether she could put off buying new shoes for another month, the soles of her current pair worn thin enough that she could feel the cold tile through them on slow mornings. By the time the rush died down, her arms ached from carrying trays, and her voice had gone slightly hoarse from a morning of greeting customers and calling out orders to the kitchen window. She leaned against the counter for a brief moment of quiet, wiping down the surface in slow circles, her mind drifting back, just for a second, to the gas station the night before and the strange old man who had thanked her like she'd handed him something far more valuable than a $5 bill. It was a little past 10 when the bell above the diner's front door jingled, and Maya glanced up out of habit, expecting another regular. Instead, she saw something that didn't belong in that diner at all. A long black car had pulled up outside, the kind of car that looked like it cost more than the entire building, and 2 people in sharp suits were stepping out of it, one of them holding a tablet, the other carrying a leather folder under his arm. Maya's first thought was that they had the wrong address. People like that didn't come to Magnolia Plate. They went to the kinds of restaurants 2 counties over, the ones with white tablecloths and a wine list. But then the door opened, and a third person stepped through it, and Maya's coffee pot nearly slipped right out of her hand. It was him, the man from the gas station, except he didn't look anything like he had the night before. Gone was the faded flannel shirt and the dusty old sedan. In their place was a tailored gray suit that fit him like it had been made specifically for his body, which, Maya would later learn, it had been. His gray hair was the same, his face was the same, but everything else about him seemed to belong to a different world than the one she had met him in. He scanned the diner for a moment, and when his eyes landed on Maya, his face broke into a warm smile, the kind that made the strange transformation a little less jarring, a little more human. "There she is," he said, walking toward the counter where Maya stood frozen, towel still clutched in one hand. "I was hoping you'd be working this morning." Yes, sir," Maya stammered, glancing around to see if any of the other waitresses, or her manager, Pete, had noticed the small spectacle unfolding by the counter. A few customers had already turned in their booths, curious about the well-dressed strangers who had just walked into their usual breakfast spot. "I owe you an explanation," the man said, taking a seat at the counter as if he'd been coming there for years, completely unbothered by the attention he was drawing. "And probably an apology, though I hope by the end of this you won't think one is necessary." Maya set down the coffee pot carefully, half afraid her shaking hands would spill it everywhere. "An explanation for what?" "For yesterday," he said. "For the gas station. My name is Walter Briggs. I imagine that name might not mean much to you, and honestly, I prefer it that way most days. But I own a company called Briggs Renewable Holdings. We build and operate solar and wind energy projects across the country, among a few other things." Maya blinked, trying to process what she was hearing. The name did sound familiar, vaguely, the way a name might if you'd seen it once on the news or scrolled past it in an article you didn't fully read. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "Last night, you said you forgot your wallet. You were driving an old car." "I was," Walter said, nodding. "Both of those things were true. I really did forget my wallet, and that really is my car, or one of them anyway. I keep that old sedan specifically for what I did yesterday." He paused, choosing his next words carefully, like a man who had explained this before, but still wanted to get it exactly right. "A few times a year, I put on regular clothes. I drive that old car somewhere I'm not known, and I let myself run into a little trouble. Sometimes it's a flat tire I pretend I can't fix. Sometimes it's exactly what happened yesterday, an empty tank and an empty wallet. I do it because I want to see how people treat a stranger who has nothing they can offer in return. Not money, not connections, nothing. Just a person asking for help." Maya felt her stomach twist a little, somewhere between confusion and disbelief. "So yesterday was a test?" "In a way," Walter admitted, "though I promise you, it wasn't a trick aimed at you specifically. I had no idea who would be at that gas station when I pulled in. I never know. That's the whole point. I want to see what an ordinary person does on an ordinary day, when nobody's watching and there's nothing to gain." He leaned forward slightly. "Most people walk right past, Maya. Some make excuses, tell me they don't have cash on them, even when I can see the bills in their hand. A few have actually laughed at me, like watching an old man struggle was entertainment. But you didn't do any of that. You had $5, your last $5, as you told me yourself, and you gave it to me without a second thought." "It wasn't a big deal," Maya said quietly, feeling oddly embarrassed under the weight of his attention. "I just figured you needed it more than I needed to overthink it." "That's exactly the kind of thing a person says when they don't realize how rare what they did actually is," Walter said. He paused for a moment, glancing around at the diner, the chipped paint on the window frames, the wobbly table he had probably noticed on his way in, the kind of place that didn't try to be anything other than what it was. "This place reminds me a little of the diner my mother used to take me to when I was a boy, back when a meal out was a special occasion instead of something you took for granted. I grew up with very little, Maya. My father worked in a factory that closed down when I was 14, and there were stretches of my childhood where $5 would have felt like a fortune to my family. I remember the winter our heat got shut off because we couldn't pay the bill, and I remember a neighbor down the hall, a woman who didn't have much more than we did, knocking on our door with a pot of soup because she'd heard the furnace had gone quiet. I never forgot that. I think about her more than I think about most of the deals I've ever closed." He reached for the leather folder his assistant had carried in and set it gently on the counter between them. "I started doing this years ago, long before Briggs Renewable Holdings was anything more than an idea I scribbled on the back of a napkin because I wanted to find a way to honor people like that neighbor, people the world doesn't always notice. Maya glanced down at the folder but didn't touch it, her hands still trembling slightly from the shock of the whole morning. What's in there? An opportunity, Walter said simply. I'm not in the business of repaying $5 with $5, Maya. That seems almost insulting given what your $5 actually represented. So instead, I had my team look into a few things last night, with your permission, of course, which I'm asking for now even though I admit I jumped the gun a little by having them start already. He smiled, a little sheepishly. Inside that folder is a full scholarship offer to finish your business degree, wherever you'd like to finish it, along with a paid summer internship at my company, working directly with our community investment division. It's real, Maya. It's not a publicity stunt, and there are no strings attached beyond what you'd expect from any normal scholarship program. Maya opened the folder with hands that didn't feel entirely like her own. Inside were several pages of official-looking documents, letterhead from a foundation she'd never heard of, the Briggs Family Foundation, and details of a scholarship program she hadn't known existed until that very moment. There was also a typed letter, addressed to her by name, outlining the internship position, the pay, the dates, the responsibilities. I don't know what to say, Maya finally managed, looking up from the papers with eyes that had started to sting in a way she hoped wasn't visible. You don't have to say anything right now, Walter said gently. Take your time, talk to your family, think about whether this is something you actually want, because I don't want you to feel pressured into it just because of how it happened. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't hoping you'd say yes. By that point, the entire diner had gone quiet. Every booth turned toward the counter, every customer pretending not to listen while listening very closely. Pete, the manager, had come out from the kitchen at some point during the conversation and was standing near the register with his arms crossed and his mouth slightly open, looking like a man who couldn't decide whether to be proud or stunned. Maya looked down at the folder again, then back up at Walter, and finally found her voice. Can I ask you something? Of course. What happens to the people who don't help you, the ones who walk past or make excuses? Walter considered the question for a moment. Nothing happens to them, he said. I'm not in the business of punishing people for being cautious or busy or distracted. Most folks who walk past me aren't bad people. They're just people, caught up in their own lives, the same way I was caught up in mine before I learned to slow down enough to notice. I don't judge them for it, but I do remember the ones who stop. I remember the ones who give something when they have nothing to gain from it. There aren't as many of you as you'd think, Maya. That's why I keep doing this. Maya thought about her grandmother again, about all those years of hearing her talk about willingness over wealth, and she felt something settle in her chest, a kind of quiet certainty that this moment, strange as it was, made a kind of sense she couldn't fully explain. I'll do it, she said. The scholarship, the internship, I'll do it. Walter's face broke into a genuine smile, the kind that reached all the way to his eyes. I'm glad to hear that, truly. He stood, straightening his suit jacket, and extended a hand toward her. Welcome to the program, Maya Thompson. She shook his hand, still half convinced she was going to wake up any second back in her car at the gas station, the whole thing nothing more than an exhausted daydream. But the folder in her other hand felt real, the weight of the papers solid and undeniable. Before he left, Walter turned back toward her one more time. One more thing, he said. When you finish your degree, when you've built whatever it is you're going to build, I hope you'll remember to be the stranger at the gas pump sometime. Not because you owe it to me, but because somebody out there is going to need exactly what you gave me yesterday, and they won't always be lucky enough to find it. Maya nodded, unable to find words that felt big enough for the moment, and watched as Walter Briggs and his two assistants walked back out to the long black car, leaving Magnolia Plate behind in a silence that lasted a full 10 seconds before the entire diner erupted into noise, customers turning to each other, to Maya, to Pete, all asking the same question at once. Did that really just happen? It had, and the days that followed felt almost as strange as that morning itself. One of Walter's assistants, moved by what she had witnessed, had posted a short account of the encounter online that evening, not mentioning Maya's last name out of respect for her privacy, but describing the moment in enough detail that it spread quickly through the small Georgia town, and, within a few days, well beyond it. People shared it not because a billionaire was involved, though that certainly caught attention, but because of how ordinary the moment had been right up until it wasn't. A tired stranger at a gas pump, a nearly empty tank, a young woman with her last $5, giving it away without a second thought. It was the kind of story that made people stop scrolling, the kind that made them think about the last time they had been in a position to help someone and what they had chosen to do with that chance. For about a week, Magnolia Plate saw more business than it had in years. Strangers drove in from neighboring counties just to sit at the counter where the encounter had happened, ordering coffee they didn't really want, just for an excuse to ask Pete or one of the other waitresses whether the story was true. A local news station sent a reporter out one afternoon, and Maya, uncomfortable with the attention but unwilling to be rude, agreed to a short interview where she mostly talked about her grandmother and very little about herself. She kept saying the same thing, in slightly different words, to everyone who asked, that she hadn't done anything special, that anyone would have done the same thing in her position, even though somewhere in the back of her mind she suspected that wasn't entirely true, not after what Walter had told her about all the people who walked past him without a second glance. Some of the attention made her uneasy. A few strangers online accused her of staging the whole thing for attention, insisting that nobody just hands over their last $5 to a man in a parking lot, not realizing how closely they had just described exactly the kind of person Maya had been raised to be. Her mother told her not to read the comments, advice Maya mostly followed, though curiosity got the better of her some nights when she couldn't sleep. What helped more than anything was the steady stream of people from her own town who stopped by the diner just to tell her, quietly, without any cameras around, that the story had reminded them of someone, a parent, a neighbor, a grandmother of their own, who had taught them the same lesson Odessa had taught Maya. Those conversations meant more to her than anything the news cameras captured. Maya called her mother that same evening, sitting on the edge of her bed with the folder open in her lap, and told her everything: the gas station, the diner, the scholarship, the internship. Her mother, Loretta, was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion she was trying hard to keep steady. "Your grandmother always said, 'Kindness comes back around,'" Loretta said softly. "I didn't think it would come back around quite like this, but I suppose the Lord has his own way of doing things. I keep thinking I should call him back and make sure it's real," Maya admitted. "It feels like something that happens to other people, not to me." "It happened because of you, baby," her mother said. "Not because you got lucky, because of who you are. Don't forget that part." Maya didn't forget it, not in the weeks that followed, when she met with an advisor from the university to figure out how to re-enroll for the fall semester, not in the months after that, when she packed up her small apartment and said a tearful goodbye to Denise, promising to visit on weekends when she could. She didn't forget it when she walked back onto a college campus for the first time in 2 years, nervous and excited in equal measure, carrying a backpack that felt lighter than it should have, given everything riding on the semester ahead. That first week back was harder than she expected. She was 2 years older than most of the other students in her classes, and there were moments, sitting in a lecture hall full of 19-year-olds, discussing internships and spring break plans, when Maya felt like a visitor in a life that should have belonged to her all along. She missed the rhythm of the diner, the easy familiarity of regulars and wobbly tables, even the ache in her feet at the end of a long shift. College felt, at first, like a language she had once spoken fluently and was now relearning word by word. It got easier with time, the way most hard things do. She joined a study group for her accounting class, made a friend named Priya, who was also a few years older than the typical student, having spent time caring for a sick parent of her own before returning to finish her degree. The two of them would sometimes sit in the campus dining hall long after their trays were empty, talking about the strange, winding paths that had brought them both back to school, comparing notes on what it felt like to rebuild a life that had been interrupted. Maya found a kind of comfort in those conversations, a reminder that her story, as unusual as it had become, was also part of something much more common than people realized: the quiet, unglamorous work of starting over. She called Walter's office every few months, not because he required it, but because she wanted him to know how things were going, and he always made time for the call, asking thoughtful questions, and never once making her feel like she owed him anything beyond honesty about how she was doing. Those calls became something Maya looked forward to, small check-ins that felt less like obligation and more like the kind of mentorship she hadn't realized she'd been missing. The internship came the following summer, just as Walter had promised. Maya spent 10 weeks working with the Community Investment Division of Briggs Renewable Holdings, learning about how the company funded small business grants in towns much like her own, towns that didn't usually make it onto anyone's map of opportunity. She sat in meetings where decisions were made that would put solar panels on the roofs of community centers, decisions that would help small farms switch to cleaner energy and save money they desperately needed. She remembered one meeting in particular, sitting at the end of a long conference table while her supervisor walked through a proposal for a town not unlike her own, a town with a struggling main street and a school that hadn't been renovated in 30 years, and feeling a kind of recognition settle over her, the sense that the spreadsheets and budget lines on the screen were really just numbers standing in for people's lives, for kitchens that would finally have working stoves, for kids who would finally have working lights in their classrooms. She made friends that summer too, other interns from cities and backgrounds very different from her own, and in the evenings they would sometimes gather in someone's apartment, ordering cheap takeout and talking about what they hoped to do once they finished school. Maya found herself talking more about her hometown than she expected to, about Magnolia Plate and the Wobbly Table 6 and the regulars who ordered the same thing every single day, and she noticed how the stories made the other interns lean in, the way people lean in toward something real. She learned more in those 10 weeks than she had in 2 years of textbooks, not because the classroom hadn't mattered, but because seeing the work up close gave shape to everything she had only read about before. Walter checked in on her a handful of times that summer, never with the fanfare of that first morning at the diner, just quiet, brief conversations in the hallway or over coffee in the break room. He asked about her classes, about her mother's health, about whether the work felt meaningful to her. He never once brought up the gas station again, as if he understood that the moment had already said everything it needed to say, and there was no use repeating it. There was one afternoon, near the end of the summer, when Walter found Maya alone in the break room, staring out the window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands. He asked what was on her mind, and after a moment of hesitation, she admitted she was nervous about going back to school in the fall, worried that everything she'd learned that summer would feel disconnected from textbooks and lectures, worried that she'd lose the sense of purpose she'd found in those 10 weeks once she was back in a classroom instead of a conference room. "You won't lose it," Walter told her, leaning against the counter beside her. "The classroom gives you the language for what you already understand in your gut. Don't be afraid of going back. Be afraid of forgetting why you went in the first place." It was a small piece of advice, but Maya carried it with her for years afterward, especially on the nights when school felt far removed from anything that mattered. Maya graduated 2 years later, the first in her family to finish a 4-year degree, and her mother, whose treatment had gone well enough that she was able to make the trip, sat in the audience with tears streaming down her face the entire ceremony. Maya had asked the university to print her grandmother's name in the program, alongside a short note thanking her for everything she'd taught her, and when she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, she found herself glancing up at the sky for just a second, the way she sometimes did when she wanted to imagine Odessa was somewhere watching. Denise had driven 3 hours to be there too, bringing a bouquet of flowers nearly as tall as she was, and crying almost as hard as Loretta did, insisting through her tears that she had always known Maya would end up somewhere like this, even back when they were splitting groceries and counting coins for laundry money. Walter sent flowers, along with a short note that read simply, "Proud of you. Now go be the stranger at the gas pump." Maya kept that note tucked into the same folder he had given her that first morning, the corners of both growing soft from how often she opened it over the years, not because she needed reminding of what had happened, but because she liked having proof, on the hard days, that it had been real. She framed a small copy of the note years later and hung it above her desk, where it stayed for as long as she ran her own program, a quiet reminder, on the mornings when the work felt slow or thankless, that even small gestures, given honestly, had a way of growing into something much larger than they first appeared. She didn't go to work for Briggs Renewable Holdings full-time, not because she wasn't grateful for the opportunity, but because the experience had shown her something about herself she hadn't fully understood before. She wanted to build something of her own, something rooted in the same small towns that had raised her, the kind of place that rarely got a second look from big companies looking for their next investment. With a small loan, a lot of help from people who believed in her, and the lessons she had carried out of that internship, Maya started a community lending program of her own a few years later, focused on helping small business owners in towns like the one she grew up in, people who had good ideas and not enough access to the kind of capital that made those ideas possible. It was slow going at first, the way most meaningful things are. The first year, Maya operated out of a single rented office above a hardware store not unlike the one she'd worked at in high school, with a single part-time assistant and a spreadsheet she updated by hand every night before bed. There were nights she sat at her kitchen table doing the same kind of tired math she'd done in her car outside that grocery store years earlier, except this time the numbers belonged to other people's dreams instead of just her own survival. She remembered the first loan her program ever approved, a small amount that helped a woman named Loretta Banks, no relation to Maya's own mother despite sharing a first name, buy a second-hand oven for the bakery she had been running out of her kitchen for 2 years. When the bakery finally opened its doors on Main Street, Maya stood across the street and watched the first customers walk in, and she thought about Walter Briggs, about the folder he had slid across the diner counter all those years ago, about how one small act of trust had a way of multiplying itself into something far bigger than anyone could have predicted. She kept at it, remembering, more often than she could count, the way Walter Briggs had looked at her that morning in the diner and told her that there weren't as many people as you'd think who stopped to help a stranger with nothing to gain. Over the following years, her program grew slowly but steadily, helping a mechanic open his own garage, helping a young couple start a small daycare for working parents who had nowhere else to leave their children, helping an elderly seamstress keep her shop running after her husband passed and the bills became too much to manage alone. None of it made the news the way Maya's own story once had. Most of it happened quietly, the way real change usually does, one small loan and one grateful phone call at a time. Her mother's health held steady over those years, the treatments having done their work, and Loretta liked to come by the office some afternoons just to sit in the corner with a cup of tea and watch her daughter work, beaming with the same pride Odessa used to carry whenever she talked about her granddaughter, the little CEO who had finally grown into the title. There was an evening, a few years into running the program, when Maya sat alone in her office long after everyone else had gone home, looking over a stack of applications from people hoping for help getting their small businesses off the ground. She found herself thinking about how strange it was that a single $5 bill, handed over on a tired evening at a gas station, had somehow unfolded into all of this, into a room full of paperwork representing dozens of other people's hopes, into a life she could never have predicted for herself back when she was counting coins for rent money. She thought about the version of herself sitting in that car outside the grocery store, certain that $5 was the smallest, most insignificant amount of money in the world, and she wished, for a moment, that she could reach back through time and tell that tired young woman that the $5 mattered more than she could possibly understand in that moment. Not because of what it bought, but because of what it revealed about who she already was. Years later, on an ordinary evening that felt a lot like the one that had started everything, Maya pulled into a gas station on her way home from a long day of meetings, the kind of day that left her more tired than she wanted to admit. As she stood at the pump, she noticed a young man a few spots over, patting down his pockets with a familiar kind of frustration, his face flushed with embarrassment as he realized he'd left his wallet somewhere he couldn't easily get back to. Maya didn't hesitate. She walked over, pulled some cash from her own wallet, more than $5 this time, though the amount almost didn't matter, and handed it to him with the same simple words her grandmother had taught her. The same words she'd once said to a stranger in a faded flannel shirt who had turned out to be far more than he appeared. "Here," she said, "pay it forward sometime." The young man thanked her, climbed into his car, and drove off, never knowing the story behind the woman who had just helped him, never knowing how far back that small act of kindness traced, all the way to a tired waitress with her last $5, a billionaire testing the goodness of strangers, and a single decision that had quietly rewritten the course of an entire life. Maya watched his taillights disappear into the evening, the same way Walter's once had, and for a moment, standing alone at the pump with the sky turning orange above her, she felt her grandmother's voice settle gently in her chest, the way it always did in moments like this one, reminding her that the smallest gifts, given freely, have a way of finding their way back around, often in shapes nobody could have predicted, and always, in the end, worth far more than the $5 they started as.